Hello again and welcome. My name is Lizzie Lithgow and I'm the AVP of Marketing here at Carnegie. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Narratives at the Nexus, Storytelling and Service to Brand Building, with Carnegie's EVP of Creative, Voltaire Santos Miran. Before we get started today, let's do a quick audio check. Just want to make sure we're coming in loud and clear. If a few people wouldn't mind using the raise your hand feature to let us know that audio is coming in loud and clear, would really appreciate it. Perfect. All right, a couple of housekeeping items we want to cover quickly before we get started. Today's webinar will last about 45 minutes with an additional 10 to 15 minutes reserved at the end for Q&A. If you'd like to submit a question for Volt, please use the Zoom control panel's Q&A feature to send a question directly to our presenters. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. We've also opened up the Zoom chat room. Feel free to share your ideas, ask questions, and interact with other attendees during the presentation. Just make sure you have your settings set to all attendees and presenters. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared along with today's slide deck next week. We'll give you early access to the recording. Just watch your email and we'll send you a note when the content is available. And finally, a shameless plug, please help us out by filling out the quick post-webinar survey at the end. Your comments and ratings are greatly appreciated and influence topic selection for future webinars. You'll receive a follow-up email encouraging you to submit the survey shortly after we conclude today's session. Now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Volt.
Awesome. Thanks, Lizzie. And everyone, thank you for taking an hour out of your very busy days to join us. Much appreciated. So as Lizzie mentioned, I am the EVP for Creative at Carnegie. A little bit more about me. I've lived in Chicago for almost 55 years now. And in my career, I've spent roughly 35 years in communications and in development. Prior to coming to Carnegie, I was the CEO and the co-founder of mStoner, a web agency that worked with more than 200 institutions over 20 years to launch websites. And I also lead our artificial intelligence initiatives at Carnegie. Personally, I'm a cook, I'm a CrossFitter, I am desperately trying to learn French, and I'm a dog dad to two adorable miniature poodles. If anyone else is into CrossFit, I would love to hear whether you're doing the Murph or whether you've done the Murph and what your time is. Feel free to throw that in the chat, and let's get started. So we've got a lot of ground to cover today, and there are 4 topics that I want to explore with you. The first is the power of story. The second is engagement and differentiation. The third is operationalizing story. And the fourth is lesson learned. So let's get started. If you've ever been in a webinar with me about storytelling, then you know that I'm a huge fan of Jonathan Gottschall's book, The Storytelling Animal, How Stories Make Us Human. He talks in the book about the fact that stories teach us facts about the world. They influence our moral logic, and they mark us with fears, hopes, and anxieties that alter our behavior and even our personalities. So I figure the best place to start when we're talking about storytelling and brand building is to talk about how stories impact our lives. And it would be enough, more than enough, if the only thing that stories did was provide pleasure, right? If all they did was entertain us and give us a sense of satisfaction and a sense of pleasure for a little bit, that would be good enough, and probably even more than good enough. But there are 7 more purposes that stories serve in our lives. Stories help us to solve problems. Through hearing or reading stories of others of solving problems that we're able to find strength and insight to solve our own. Stories also help us to assimilate. Stories help us to adapt to new situations more easily. Stories help us to impart traditions. They pass on values, rituals, and meaning. They teach. They provide pattern and order in our lives. They help us to connect. And they finally help us to define ourselves, both to ourselves and define ourselves to others. So stories serve these really great 8 purposes in our lives. One of the things that I wanted to explore in putting this webinar together is, how does that apply to brand building? And so I want to remix those purposes just a little bit for you. And before that, let me give you this quote from Paul Zak: a compelling story with an emotional trigger alters our brain chemistry, making us more trusting, understanding, and open to ideas. The quote within itself is fascinating enough. It becomes even more interesting when you find out what neuroeconomics is. Neuroeconomics is basically a cross-disciplinary study of psychology and neurology, how it is that we make decisions and how you use stories to impact individual economic decisions and economic decisions at a regional, country, and global level. So the fact that someone like Paul Zak has spent his life learning about how to use story to optimize profits for corporate ventures and also to shift economics for countries, I think is really a testament to how powerful story is in our lives. But let's talk about what that means for brand. We remix that just a little. We find that we have those same 8 purposes slightly reframed. So this quote from Forbes kicks us off. Brand storytelling weaves together the facts and emotions that your brand evokes. And organizations need to start sharing the story behind their brand, why it exists, and why that matters. If you read this article from Forbes, it starts by talking about the fact that we are an incredibly fast-paced, oversaturated, digitally driven society. And the fact that because everything is so instantly gratified for us, and we have everything at our fingertips and at our phone tips, then the premium of an actual human connection, human experience becomes even more scarce and even more coveted. So what do those 8 purposes look like when we're talking about brand? Well, the first is that brand stories help to entertain and engage. They surprise and delight, they capture attention, they create positive memories. The second purpose that story serves in a branding context is it helps us to make and to reinforce decisions. So brand-driven storytelling builds consistency that reinforces decisions and the choices we ask our audiences to make. A really great example of this is if any of you have taken a look at the yield campaigns that get launched on social media once acceptances have gone out. There are a number of institutions who have done incredible jobs mobilizing social media in order to help the yield process. And one of the things I learned in doing research about this is the reason that social media yield campaigns are so really effective is that at that point in the student journey, when a student has decided this is the place I want to go, that there's still a little bit of indecision there. There's still a little bit of fear that they might be making the wrong choice. But when they log in to Facebook or they log in into Instagram and they see all of these people holding up their I got accepted signs and the swag and talking about how excited they are to become part of a university or college community, then that reinforces the decisions that those prospective students are making. So that's a really great example of how stories help enforce the brand affiliation decisions that we try to make. The third purpose is that brands help us to find our people. I did some work for Harvey Mudd in college, probably about 15 years ago. And when I went on campus, if you've ever been to Harvey Mudd, you see unicycles everywhere. And they talk about this great tradition that they have for using unicycles to get around campus and the way that they would hop on their unicycles to go to the local donut shop on Saturdays. So they tell these stories to prospective students because, someone who looks at that and says, yeah, unicycles and donuts are really not my thing, knows that Harvey Mudd might not be the place they'll fit in. But people who are like, unicycles, this is awesome, knows that Harvey Mudd might be a place where they're going to find really strong community. Purpose number 4, stories help create and reinforce culture. They help us to understand, adopt, and adapt to the organizations to which we've chosen to belong. When I was thinking about an example of this, I was thinking about my days in the church. I went to a large Southern Baptist church in Chicago for the better part of 10 years, and the pastor of that church was an expert storyteller. And every now and then, he would single out someone in the congregation. Sometimes it was a leader that everyone was very familiar with. Sometimes it was someone that no one had heard of before. But he would talk about the difference they made to the church, either showing up a little bit early to make sure that something was set up for an event or staying late to talk with people. And it was through those stories that we understood what community should look like and what it should feel like at the church. So stories can help reinforce the culture we're trying to create. Stories are also ways for us to advocate. The stories we tell other people will strengthen the brand that we believe in and that we support. Sixth purpose for story is to provide the answer to why. We are really good a lot of times at talking about the what, but when we talk about brand and we talk about emotional connection, the why becomes all the more important. And stories provide that sort of context for that content, and it makes content more accessible and more consequential. Purpose number 7, stories build lasting relationships. Stories have a great way of humanizing institutions. They give us the ability to meet a basic need to connect with others emotionally, which is more and more important, as Forbes pointed out, in our increasingly digitally driven world. And the final purpose that stories serve in a branding context, they heighten affinity and they build loyalty. Stories can strengthen our ties with organizations with which we share common or complementary values and goals. I can think of no example better than an alumni magazine, right? I'm sure many of you get alumni magazines from your institutions, and I don't know about you, but there are two things that I do with the alumni magazine. The first thing I do is I read the cover and I find out about this really incredible alum who's doing some great things. And typically that makes me proud of my institution or prouder of my institution, prouder of my degree. But then I also turn to the back and I take a look at the class notes and I want to find out who of my classmates is doing well. And that's a chance for me to celebrate and to remember what it was like to be in community with them as an undergraduate. So brand is really served by story because story is fundamental to us as human beings. So let's talk about, assuming that you all believe that branding is served really well by stories, let's talk about how stories can help engage and how they can help differentiate. And for this, we're going to play a game. And the game is called Brand Promise Bingo. Okay? Now, there are two ways to win in this game. The first is your typical way, 5 across, up and down, or diagonally. Or the second way to win is the total numbers of squares that you check. So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to either sketch out a 5x5 table on a piece of paper, or if you're like me, to open up an Excel document and create a table, or open up a Word document and plop a 5x5 table in. And if you are one of those people, then I've just found I've just found more of my people in you. All right, so let's get started with Brand Promise Bingo. And what does bingo stand for when we talk about branding? B, being part of a community that's ... I, intellectual and academics unparalleled. N, nowhere better than here because. G, greatest time ever. And O, outcomes that matter. All right, y'all ready to play? All right, B, here are your 5 words: inclusive, collaborative, innovative, diverse, nurturing, and supportive. So mark off on your tables any time or any of those instances where you have seen or used those words in order to talk about or to market your institution. All right, let's move on to I. Faculty who are leaders in their field and who know your name. Research opportunities, experiential learning and real-world experience, the development of critical thinking skills, and staff who are committed to your personal success. Again, mark off any of those squares if you've used those descriptions or something quite like them in your marketing or your communications. All right. N, nowhere better than here because state-of-the-art learning facilities, proximity to a major metropolitan area with corporate partners that ensure great internship opportunities, a beautiful campus, nice dorms and great food, and recreational options for everyone. All right, let's move on to G, greatest time ever. Friends you'll keep for your entire life. The chance to rediscover or reinvent yourself, freedom to explore your interests, a vibrant campus life full of history and traditions, and sports and cultural events alike. All right, and O, outcomes that matter. Beginning of a long and successful career, a high chance at a good job right after graduation, a strong network of proud alums who always have your back, degrees that become more valuable over time, and the number of alumni who get accepted to grad school. All right, let's see how we all did. Lizzie, would you launch our poll, please? 2 questions here. Did you get bingo, yes or no? And how many of you got 20 or more squares, 15 or more squares, 10 or more squares, 5 or more squares, or less than 5 squares? Let's see how we did, everyone. Please take the poll. Lizzie, how are the results coming in?
It looks like about 72% right now said yes, they got bingo. And well, there's still a lot of numbers coming in, so they're kind of changing a little, but 40% of folks had 15 to 20 squares. So that's our highest percentage for answer 2.
All right, all right, all right. Are we still trickling in results, Lizzie, or are we?
It looks like they're slowing down. So 45% final number for 15 to 20 squares, and about 75% got a bingo.
All right. So, Lizzie, when we were talking about this before the webinar, Lizzie asked me how I thought people would feel about this, the higher their score. And what I want to say is I didn't mean this game to be pejorative in any way, right? Because, I mean, let's face it, how would you not want to say these things? I mean, who is going to buy a university or college experience where you're like, yeah, we're not really all that inclusive and we're pretty much stuck in our ways and there's not much diversity and we really treat you like a number and our facilities are not that great, the food is kind of crappy and you may or may not get a job, right? No one is going to sign on for that. The fact of the matter is that we talk about all of these things because these are the things that prospective students and their families want. They're the things that they aspire to and they dream of. And that's why we talk about this, is because this is what they want the experience to be. But this is where story comes in. See, story has this great way of basically taking a cliche or a claim and transforming them into current or compelling realities. So let me give you a quick example of this. This is a viewbook spread from Samford University, and it hits many of the notes that we just talked about with bingo, right? The really wide network of alumni, the rankings that people look to, the number of different students from the number of different states, the number of alumni, the percentage of alumni who are working or going on to grad school within 6 months. So absolutely, these are things that they care about, but it becomes more important to them, or it becomes real when you read the story of Whitney to the left. And the Whitney story is basically that she wanted to go into sports television production, which is a highly competitive field and probably not the most welcoming field for women when she started. And the way that she got her start in that is that she got a recommendation from a trusted professor who got her into an internship that then led to positions at ESPN, CBS, and NBC Sports. So when you actually have a story that backs up the claims that you are making about the student experience, then those claims become real. All right? So there are 3 steps in being able to differentiate and to connect. The first step is to know who you are and to know who you're not. Now, I will say that in my experience, too many institutions try to be all things to all people, right? And I don't even want to do a show of hands here because I would bet that a lot of you will say, yeah, my institution says that we need to be everything to everyone. But the fact of the matter is that you don't need to be and you shouldn't. So there are three factors that I would say you should consider in figuring out what your brand personality needs to be. The first is you need to look internally. You need to talk with your stakeholders and find out who they say you are, right? The second is then to find out who the external market perceives you to be. There's the perception that you have with all your stakeholders, but then there's the wider perception of the world. And it's amazing to find out how sometimes the perceptions that internal stakeholders have and the way the world sees you can be almost diametrically opposed. The third thing to do is to consider the competitive landscape. What are your competitors and your peers saying? What are they doing? And how do you rank and place in that landscape? Now, if you're able to take these three things and figure out that sweet spot, that wide open space in the center, that's where you want to stake your market position. That's where you want to start to build your brand story. So part one to being able to tell stories that differentiate and connect is to understand who you are and who you're not. The second is to understand who your audiences are. Now, when I say understanding who your audiences are, I mean going beyond the demographics, knowing more about what drives their decision making than where they live, how old they are, how much money their parents might make. It's this idea of establishing a sense of empathy. Indy Young, who's one of the front runners of digital and experience design. I got the chance to work with her several years ago. She's just an amazing, amazing researcher and student of human nature. And she talks about the fact that empathy is about understanding what's going on in a person's head and heart and acknowledging their reasoning and emotions as valid, even when they differ from your own. So how do you get past the demographics? Well, the best way to do it is you talk to your audiences. You could do something as informal as what I'm flashing on the screen right now. This is an experience map. This is a project that we did with a Canadian institution a few years back, and we were studying the prospective international student journey. And what we did is we basically interviewed a number of recently accepted students in their first term who had come from, I would say, about 6 to 8 different countries. And we knew at first where they came from, we knew what they were studying, but it wasn't until we talked with them, until we realized what the process was like. And with some of the things that we learned in talking with students is that depending on the country that you're from, some students actually did all of their research via social media. And they said, you know what? I trust people who come from my own country more than I trust the admissions counselors. So I will get basic information from the website, but when it comes to choosing a program, finding a place to live, figuring out how to pay for this, figuring out what the process is to get my student visa, and everything else that's involved with transitioning my life from one country to another, I'm going to do that with people I trust because they're friends on Facebook. We also found that a number of people reported that the most stressful part of this was the time between deciding and accepting and making the transition, because all of the things that they had to do in that very compressed time period. That is stuff that we would have never, ever heard if all we were doing was looking at survey information or demographic data. Another way you can go about this is this idea of psychographics. Now, demographics tell you where people live and basics about their profile. Psychographics can actually tell you what a person wants. Now, I don't have time to go into the process of psychographics, but I do have at the end of this webinar a link to learn more if you're interested on what psychographics entail. The third step is basically knowing what makes a story a story. So Aristotle talked about story in 5 parts: exposition, complication, crisis, climax, and resolution. Pixar has a slightly more approachable way of describing this. Once upon a time, one day, because of that, and until finally. There's a third reference that I would like you all to consider. And that's Scott Belsky, who wrote the book, The Messy Middle. And what he was talking about in the book was basically the process of going from a great idea to realizing a goal. Maybe it was launching a new endeavor, starting a new business, whatever. And he talks about the messy middle, what people don't normally think about or want to know about, where you go up and down and you have these peak moments and then you have these valley moments. And it's not just one peak and it's not just one valley moment. It goes up and down and up and down. What he embodied here is what we call the hero's journey. And what I find in the research that I've done is we resonate most with the stories that have this level of churn where things are going well and then badly and well and then badly. The messy middle or the conflict is what makes a story worth reading. Otherwise, it's just words. So let me give you one. Oh, I wanted to quote Carly Rae Jepsen in this, so I'm going to do it. So one of the things I find with institutions is that everyone wants to basically, quote unquote, cut to the feeling, right? They want to get to that mountaintop moment. I see a singular heart floating. Thank you. Carly Rae Jepsen, hopelessly underrated. I mean, honestly, who would have thought that she could have recreate the same magic of Call Me Maybe and cut to the feeling? But okay, we'll save that for another time. We want to cut to the mountaintop moment where the churn, the conflict, the time when we think that something might not happen is where the story takes place. That's so awesome. All right, so let me give you an example of what I think is some really brilliant storytelling, courtesy of Linda Bonin, who had launched this campaign, the University of Alabama, Where Legends Are Made. So what was really cool about the University of Alabama is they spent a good deal of time trying to figure out who they were and what they wanted to be, and the values that they leaned into included leadership, transformation, vision, tenacity, and this sense of grit. Now, a lot of institutions can claim leadership, transformation, vision, tenacity, and grit. But the University of Alabama created a way to frame all of that and to focus on the people who are the heroes of the story. And they launched this campaign called Where Legends Are Made. Now, one of the things that we learned in working with the University of Alabama is speaking to psychographics. We found that knowing the brand personality of University of Alabama, we could then take a look at their prospective student base and parse that student base according to psychographics. We found that some people were like high achieving honor students who were really going to resonate with messages of leadership. There were other people who were just figuring out what they wanted to do and who they wanted to be. And they resonated or would resonate with messages of being in an established institution. There were people who were diehard Bama fans who were there for the love of the game. And they resonated with the grit and the tenacity that is part of the Alabama brand. And then there are the people who live for the rush of the moment. Those are the people who get heavily involved in fraternities and sororities and organizations, and they look for opportunities for group philanthropy, and they want to just be steeped in the experience. And we knew that they would lean into the leadership and the excellence of Alabama. And so what we did in starting to tell that story is we told slightly different stories. So when you take a look at this grid, more than a scholar, a legend, that was for all the high achieving honors people. More than an achiever, a legend, those were the people who were just trying to figure out who they wanted to be. More than an athlete, that part of the campaign was for those die-hard love of the game people. And then finally, more than a ringleader, a legend, that was for the people who lived for the rush of the moment. And then they started to tell all these great stories. Here's one great example. Our Legends Make Broadway History. Talks about Michael, who was cast at Hamilton, the only actor ever to play both male principal roles. And then they started telling stories and collecting stories over years on their website so they could focus on the individual heroes or the individual legends that were made at Alabama. I think it is a brilliant, brilliant campaign. And if you Google University of Alabama where legends are made, you can see all the multimedia. And I think you'll be impressed by the way that they tell the story, where they find the conflict, which is in many ways implied in all of their videos and commercials. And they really frame this as the development of the hero. All right, so we covered the power of story. We covered how to differentiate and connect. Let's talk a little bit about operationalization, because to be fair, story is a hard discipline. It takes organization, it takes diplomacy, and it takes a plan to move forward. So in order to understand how to operationalize story, I think it's first important to understand what storytelling looks like now. So Frank Rose has this great book called The Art of Immersion, and he talks about the fact that stories are universal. They've been around forever. We've been telling stories since before we even had like spoken language. But the way that the way that we tell stories change with the technology at hand. Every medium gives rise to a new form of narrative, and people want to be immersed. So let's talk a little bit about the four facets of storytelling in a digital age. Now, about 12 years ago, the New York Times launched a story called Snowfall. It was a story about some really well-experienced skiers who go out one day and get caught in an avalanche. And it was a master feat in digital storytelling. And many people point back to that story as the sort of the ushering in of the way stories are told now. It had everything. It had video, it had audio, it had infographics, it had motions on the screen, different chapters that you could explore, profiles of people, slideshow galleries. And the punchline is that it was a team of, I think, 8 to 10 people who produced it. It took 6 months and it took $150,000. It is such a great story, right? And it gave rise. That's so awesome. I love Melissa and Jennifer that you Melissa. I love the fact that you use that for teaching multimedia. It is so good, and it really it spawned storytelling in education in multiple ways. If you take a look at University of Washington and Boston University, they do a great job of taking that long form storytelling. Oh, Hannah, it's called Snowfall. And they take that long form storytelling like University of Washington and they apply that framework in a sustainable way for the resources that a university has. So this is an example of one story that the University of Washington tells about a group of researchers who come together to help this young girl to be able to feel and move and walk again. And it's got everything from video to animated graphics to these mini profiles of the researchers who are part of the effort. It has infographics to help make complex ideas more understandable and more easily digested. And it ends with a call to action. So this is one way that storytelling in this age can look. But frankly, what I'm finding is that more and more stories look like this. This is what I call a microstory. My friend Cassandra Segaran, who's the executive director for new media at Washington University of St. Louis, leads the team that works on the Faces of Washington U. And so rather than having a long form story, sometimes a story is a photograph and a caption. Sometimes it's just a quote. And I would argue that sometimes a story is really well told in a cut line, a call to action, and a logo and a few design elements. So let's talk about the four facets of digital storytelling today. The first is curated cross-channel content. Now, I got my start in alumni magazines back when they were all print. And I would remember how thrilled I was once we got everything to the printer, because at that point we thought, there's no changing anything. Everything's going to press. We are done. The difference between storytelling 30 years ago and storytelling now is that stories begin their lives when stories are published. And stories are no longer these 500 to 1,000 to 1,500 word long form narratives. A lot of times they're these micro stories. And what are micro stories but atomic units of information? A photograph, a caption, a quote, a few sentences that can stand alone or that can ladder up to a larger narrative when they're combined together. We also have metadata and keyword planning to support searchability. We have tagging and taxonomy so people can explore related content. We have cloud-based collaboration tools like Gather Content, where you can work together across departments on stories in real time. Oh, Katie, seriously, I do too. I miss those days as well every now and then. And then finally, we have these content management tools that will allow us to deploy content across social, email, web, and print. So we have a much more organized, structured way of maximizing content at that micro story level than we had before. We also have this idea of interactivity and immersion, photography, video, audio, illustrations, infographics, and data visualization. We have the ability to call people to action, right? People can amplify the story through likes and shares. They can comment, they can gift content, they can explore related stories, they can dive deeper into related content or even more content. So when I was doing web work, I would say to everyone that every single page on your website has to have a next step. If one of your pages has nowhere else to go, then you've missed an opportunity. And I would say the same for story. So if you have a story where there is no logical call to action, where there is no next step, where there's no opportunity for engagement, then you've missed a really great opportunity. And the fourth facet is measurement and optimization. We now have the analytics framework to measure and refine our stories. We can test stories, A/B testing or multivariate testing, and then we can use AI tools to aid in the production, measurement, and optimization of that content. Now, I promised everyone in the description that we would talk a little bit about AI. So that's a great segue into methodical production. So there are three things that I want you to think about in terms of methodical production. The first is asking the right questions. At the beginning of every story you produce, you should have answers for this. Who am I producing stories for? Why is it important? What do I want them to understand or learn? What do I want them to do? And here's the really fun one. What story do I want them to be able to tell about themselves as a result of my story? You take a look at that Moore College example that I showed you. You do more of what you love, or you take a look at University of Alabama, and I would say that the power behind those stories is the fact that it calls the person who is looking at that to imagine what their story is going to be. So you can't look at a legend story, you can't watch that commercial without thinking about, all right, what is the legend that I want to be? What is the legend that I want to tell? When you look at more, do more of what you love, and you are an aspiring artist looking for art school, then it really forces you to think, well, what is more of what I love? And what would it be like to be able to do more of what I love? And what would it be like if I could actually build a career doing what I love? So asking the right questions, step one. Step two is to focus on sustainability. How will I share and promote this story? How will I measure success? How will I bring the story to life with the resources that I have? What stories already exist that I can share or use? And how can I approach story production to extend our story technology toolkit? And then finally, as far as AI, when you take a look at deploying AI tools, you have to decide what issue you're trying to address, choose the right tool for the job, set your expectations properly, and finally, know that the tool you start with is not the same tool that you will probably be using in a month, 6 months, or a year. So when I say set your expectations properly, a lot of people talk about or wonder about, well, what does that mean? Exactly how much will AI make an impact? I've spent a lot of time talking with industry experts and with creative professionals, and I would say that the answer really depends. When you talk, for instance, about idea generation, you're talking about maybe a boost in productivity of 10 to 20%. when you're talking about content production or ad production or a segmentation, that is where AI can actually help you realize productivity boosts of somewhere in the 20 to 30, even 40% level. So knowing this is really helpful in setting the expectations for what AI will be used for. Now, I did give you 4 scenarios in this deck, which will be made available to you all. If what you're looking for is help with tone, grammar, and style, there are a list of 7 different AI tools that we've looked at that could be really, really helpful. When we talk about writer's block, story arcs, or plot development, we have another list of 7 tools that you might consider. So if you're looking for help getting past a blank page or exploring plot points or figuring out what that conflict should be, these tools will be really helpful for you to check out. If your use case scenario is that you want content production, social, and SEO, oh, sure, hold on a second, Kathleen, there you go, writer's block. All right. And then Kathleen, and I will make sure that you get a copy of this so you all don't have to jot all of these down because I know I'm going really fast through these. So content production, social, and SEO, take a look at these 7 tools. And then if you take a look at, if what you need is help generating multimedia assets, then here are 7 tools that you can take a look at as well. And these do everything from helping you to generate images. And let's be honest, images are still not incredibly great for the most part. But if you're trying to storyboard something or get an idea across, there are tools that can help you to visualize, even if it's what it is a sketch. So third part of operationalizing story is measuring success. So when we talk about how we chart our success with stories, there are 3 types of metrics you can look at. You can look at engagement, likes, comments, shares, and reactions. You can look at the video views, the click-through rates, the user-generated content references to what content you put out there. You can look at reach and awareness. You can look at impressions, web traffic, referral sources, growth in followers, subscribers, or community size. You can look at sentiment analysis, positive, negative, or neutral sentiment, qualitative feedback and comments. One of my friends, Liz Gross, heads up Campus Sonar. If you haven't checked out Campus Sonar as a social listening tool, you should totally check it out because it is a really incredible way for you to hear what's happening and how people are talking about you in social. And all of this all ladders up, right? When we talk about brand effectiveness, it's a really squishy metric, to be honest with you, because brand awareness, most people will expect that it's going to impact everything. And the fact is it does, sorta, depending, right? It depends on how well you're deploying your brand, how consistently you're deploying your brand, how many people on campus have signed on and are actually helping you to deploy your brand consistently. But when we talk about branding and what case you make to senior leadership, I like to use a balanced scorecard. And there are 4 areas that brand is supposed to impact. Impacts admissions and student success, awareness and reputation, giving and alumni relations, and internal brand activation. So again, you will get a copy of this so you can dive in deeper to the different metrics that you might explore underneath each of these areas. But I wanted to give you a sense of how stories can ladder up and how you might be able to start thinking about conveying the success of your brand efforts, particularly to senior leadership when you're trying to justify the time, the expense, and the attention that you are putting to brand building. So let's finish up with the last section of this, which is lessons learned. There are 4 lessons that I want to leave you with. The first is your institution is not the hero of your story. That's really, really hard for most academic institutions to hear. But the institution is not the hero of your story. Your heroes are your students, your faculty members, your alumni, the people who make up your community. And the institution is the Yoda to the Luke Skywalker. Your institution allows the magic to happen. Your institution allows the legends to be made, but the real heroes of the story are always people. The second lesson is you need to find the messy middle, right? If there is no messy middle, all you have is a bright, verbal, attractive, smiling young student waving at the camera. And that is not a story. That is just an ad. So find the conflict in the story and focus on the conflict. The third lesson is around this idea of story itself. We talked a little bit earlier, and I think that it became very clear with that brand promise bingo that we all talk about the same things. And people have asked me in the past, well, how do you differentiate then? And what I say is stories through time have always had the same structure, the same 5 points, but we respond to that. So what makes a story your story are the details. So dig into the story, find out what those details are, find out what was only possible at your institution, find out what makes the messy middle so interesting, and focus on that, sweat those details. And then the final lesson that I will leave you with is this idea that stories transcend audiences and break down silos. What do I mean by that? I mean that the same story that will resonate with a prospective student with a little bit of tweaking will resonate with a prospective faculty member or an alum or a foundation board member. Stories will appeal to multiple audiences. And the second part of this is breaking down those silos. A lot of times what I hear from people is we just don't have time or resources to tell those stories. And what they're really saying is we don't have the staff in our department. But good storytelling is going to force you to reach across the different areas of your institution. Admissions, student life, academics, development, alumni relations, all of these stakeholders, all of these areas probably are telling similar or the same stories. So by using story as a way to mobilize and galvanize your stakeholders, you are actually affecting really great change organizationally. And so the last lesson that I would leave you with is that you need to learn to tell your stories together. Thank you. All right. I realize that we're almost to time, but let's dive into some questions. Who's got questions, please?
Our first question is from Deborah. Whoops, sorry about that. Our first question is from Deborah related to bingo. So Deborah works for a non-residential institution, so they don't have dorm life or sports. And she's wondering what some options are for our bingo card for those similar institutions.
Yeah, well, so I'll go back to the mindset, and I have not dived into your particular audience, but I do remember in the work that I've done with non-residential colleges that the decision making is a little bit different, that they're not necessarily looking for the same student experience that a residential student is looking for, but they are looking for some student experience. They are also, because it's non-residential, probably looking for convenience. They are looking for ways to fit this into the rest of their lives. And honestly, they're also looking for like the small amenities that are going to make their day easier. They're looking for, where's the microwave? Where can I go have a quiet moment to myself and warm up my lunch, right? So when you look at what sort of promises you're making and what you talk about, I would focus on how it is that you are able, or that students are able, to make their dreams possible at your institution in the most practical of ways.
Great. Thank you. Our next one comes from Jim. They say, love your guidance here about the power of story. Your advice seems to imply that we should focus on telling fewer but more powerful stories. Would you agree? Then there's a follow-up. I say this because in our institution's focus on the volume of stories to, quote, feed the beast in terms of our channels.
I love that question. I've got to tell you that there is a version of this presentation that I give where one of the lessons learned is fewer stories better told. So first of all, I affirm you, yes, telling fewer stories and telling them better is going to be much better than trying to churn out a large volume and, as you said, feed the beast. And one of the things that I would say is that we as internal stakeholders tire of everything before our audiences do. That's true of the stories we tell. It's true of the images on websites. I mean, everyone wants change internally because they see it all the time and they just want something new. Your audiences are not seeing all of this stuff with the same frequency. So I would say yes, yes, yes. Tell fewer stories, tell them better. And because content is so hard to produce, maximize the heck out of those stories, right? Across all of your channels, social, email, website, print, all of that stuff. Yeah, it's just there's so much work involved that you really need to be able to realize the full benefit.
And it looks like one more from Alessia. What's your thought on this push and heightened trend on short media content?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I love long form stories. I love long form stories. But if you take a look at Snowfall and you find out how many people actually made it all the way through and digested the entire story, it is a fraction of the number of people who actually looked at it. So I would say that it is probably the better part of valor to look at those smaller, those micro stories, because it's the way that we are consuming information. And if you think about how prospective students, for instance, or I mean, honestly, I'm 55 and I scroll endlessly on Instagram. My capacity to digest a micro story is really, really high. So you're going to reach people more if you are able to produce shorter form content, but that doesn't mean that it's easier to produce, right? A lot of times, creating that short form content is actually harder because you have fewer pieces to play with and you have more constraints that you have to work under. So I love the idea of doing a lot of micro content that then can be stitched together into a larger narrative. I don't think that you do that for all of your stories, but I think that you will find that there are some stories where you can tell micro stories that then get knit together and become a larger narrative, part of a larger theme.
It's like one other one coming in. Marlena says, this was fantastic. Thank you. Any tips for how to use this concept in everyday conversations with students and not just in our marketing materials?
Oh, yeah. I mean, story is like everywhere, right? So if the one thing that you walk away from this webinar thinking is stories resonate, then you can weave stories into everything that you do, into a conversation. And I don't know what department you're with. I don't know what area you're part of, but you can weave stories into individual conversations with students and parents where you have a set of anecdotes, for instance, of stories that you might tell. And those stories might be 30 seconds long, but there are ways for you to illustrate what you're trying to get across. For some reason, and I don't know why I'm thinking of this, but I'm going to share it, and I'm sure there's some sort of synapse firing. When I was working for North Idaho College, I went on a tour with someone in the student life department, and she was an alum. And we were just walking along, and I was just asking, and if you have not been to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, it is stunningly gorgeous, stunningly gorgeous. So we're walking along, and I'm remarking at how beautiful it is, and I'm just asking her about her experience. And she said, well, I was a student here. I've got to tell you, what they talk about in terms of caring for the students is really true. When I was a student, there was a time when I couldn't make ends meet. I didn't have a lot of money. And so I started skipping lunch. And one of my professors noticed me one day not eating. And she came up and she asked me what was going on.
and she brought me to the financial aid office, and they set me up and they got me a lunch package. And honestly, I almost started crying as I was walking along with her because I'm like, oh my God, that is the most beautiful story ever. Thank you. You just made NIC more of a reality to me. So you can weave stories into everyday conversations just to touch on or illustrate points that might help with whatever it is that you're talking about.
Okay, well, we are running out of time, so we gotta cut it today. But if we didn't answer your question, we'll try to follow up with you personally after the webinar. Just wanted to say thanks again to everyone who's joined. I'll be adding the resource links in the chat right now. So those resources that Voltaire has mentioned during the presentation, you have access to those. And we'll share those again when we share the recording. Quick and friendly reminder, please don't forget to fill out the post-webinar survey. It'll take you less than 3 minutes to complete. And it's incredibly helpful to our team as we're always looking to improve our content and delivery of these webinars. So thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you at the next Carnegie event.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.